Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Today, we're discussing The Promise by South African novelist Damon Galgut, which follows the Swart family as each member comes to terms with a promise made by the father to his dying wife that their servant and housekeeper, Salome, would be given ownership of her small house on the family's land.
The Promise won the Booker Prize in 2021. Fellow novelist Rose Tremaine called Galgut the most worthy winner of the Booker Prize we've seen for many years. She added, "The book trembles in the hand with its political relevance." Meanwhile, Elizabeth Day called it a masterpiece, one of the best books I've read in the past decade, a moving, brilliantly told family epic.
The book is no stranger to us here on the pod, as we enjoyed reading and discussing it for our Booker Prize episode. But that was before my book club got their teeth into it. What did they think? Did it spark debate? And whether they loved or loathed it, the big question is, was it a great book club book? Keep listening, as we're joined by Stuart Marshall, regular member of my book club, to find out.
Hi Stuart, welcome to the pod.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Nice to join you in the virtual podcast shed.
Feels very familiar to me to have you here, because I'm quite used to seeing you on screen. I particularly wanted you to join us because you, unlike anyone else in my book club, actually have a family connection to South Africa, don't you?
I certainly do, yeah. My mother's side of the family, they actually come from Holland but spent the majority of their lives out in South Africa. My mum lived there till she was in her late 20s and I was actually born out there. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on South African politics or anything, but I definitely have a few personal experiences and some stuff that my mum's shared with me.
Okay, The Promise. What's it about? It charts the crash and burn of a white South African family living on a farm outside Pretoria. The Swarts are gathering for Ma's funeral. The younger generation, Anton and Amor, detest everything the family stand for, not least the failed promise to the black woman who has worked for them her whole life. After years of service, Salome was promised her own house, her own land. Yet somehow, as each decade passes, that promise remains unfulfilled. The narrator's eye shifts and blinks, moving fluidly between characters, flying into their dreams, deliciously lethal in its observation. And as the country moves from old, deep divisions to its new so-called fairer society, the lost promise of more than just one family hovers behind the novel's title. The audiobook is read by Peter Noble. Let's listen to a clip.
The moment the metal box speaks her name, Amor knows it's happened. She's been in a tense, headachy mood all day, almost like she had a warning in a dream but can't remember what it is. Some sign or image just under the surface. Trouble down below, fire underground. But when the words are said to her aloud, she doesn't believe them. She closes her eyes and shakes her head. No, it can't be true, what her aunt has just told her. Nobody is dead. It's a word, that's all. She looks at the word, lying there on the desk like an insect on its back with no explanation. This is in Miss Starkey's office, where the voice over the tannoy told her to go. Amor has been waiting and waiting for this moment for so long, has imagined it so many times, that it already seems like a fact. But now that the moment has really come, it feels far away and dreamy. It hasn't happened, not actually, and especially not to Ma, who will always, always be alive. "I'm sorry," Miss Starkey says again, covering her big teeth behind thin, pressed-together lips. Some of the other girls say Miss Starkey is a lesbian, but it's hard to imagine her doing anything sexy with anyone. Or maybe she did once, and has been permanently disgusted ever since. "It's a sorrow we all have to bear," she adds in a serious voice, while Tannie Marina trembles and dabs at her eyes with a tissue. Though she has always looked down on Ma, and doesn't care at all that she's dead, even if she isn't. Her aunt goes downstairs with her and waits outside, while Amor has to go back to the hostel to pack her suitcase. She's been living here for the past 7 months, waiting for what hasn't happened to happen. And every second of that time she's hated these long, cold rooms with their linoleum floors. But now that she has to leave, she doesn't want to go. All she wants to do is lie down on her bed and fall asleep and never, never wake up. Like Ma. No, not like Ma, because Ma is not asleep. Slowly she puts her clothes into the suitcase and then carries it down to the front of the main school building, where her aunt is standing, looking into the fish pond. "That's a big fat one," she says, pointing into the depths. "Have you ever seen such a big goldfish?" And Amor says that she hasn't, even though she can't see which fish her aunt is pointing at. And none of it is real anyway. When she gets into the Cressida, that isn't real either. And as they float down the winding school drive, the view from the window is a dream.
I was not that familiar with South African history beyond the really obvious big picture stuff. Obviously, I was aware of apartheid. I was aware of the end of apartheid. I knew who Nelson Mandela was. I knew that the rugby team had done well, just bits and pieces. When I read The Promise, I was very aware that it was referencing different periods in South African history. And for me, I was learning about it through the book. I was looking online and someone summed it up quite nicely. The novel traverses 4 decades of modern South Africa, starting with the last years of apartheid and proceeding through the optimism of Mandela and the Rugby World Cup, the corruption of Zuma, and ending with the faint hope and promise of a new South Africa. And so in this book, we've literally got this promise between one person and another, but also this metaphorical promise. So there's a lot going on here, plus a very character-driven story, and it's told in quite an interesting way. This narrative style is very distinct and something that certainly the Booker judges picked up on. Stuart, how did you get on with that narrative voice?
For me, that was probably the outstanding element of this book. I'm a big fan of film. It had a real cinematic edge to it. It was no surprise to me that that whole narrative structure was born out of the author's experience coming from writing a film script. He said that the narrator could behave like a camera, moving in close and then suddenly pulling far back, jumping from one character to another in the middle of a scene, or even a sentence, or following some sideline of action that has nothing to do with the plot. I think that really captured perfectly what he achieved. And I think the real skill in it was how successfully he did it, because although it did jump around rapidly from different perspectives, whether it be first person, third person, or taking you on a sideline away from the main plot, I think you always knew exactly where you were.
I found it exciting. You know, I think we're a little bit, I don't know, we're not cynical readers, but it takes a lot, I think, for me to feel excited by prose. I wasn't looking forward to reading this book. The Booker shortlist was announced. I knew I was going to have to read all the books. Read a Guardian article, and it was like, death is a consistent theme in all these books. I was like, oh, God, death? I'm thin-skinned. I don't want to read about death. And so I decided to sample each of the books through Kindle and just see which one hooked me. And this book, which is structured around 4 deaths and the short-term action after each of these deaths, is amazingly gripping, and it's not depressing. Although I have heard other people say they found it quite sad. But the author's doing something really special. I mean, I think that's why he won the Booker.
I know in book club, it was one of the points that people struggled with was this narration and the way it flits about. And Maria was saying she didn't feel it settled long enough for her to really get to know a character before suddenly it takes you off somewhere else. I think it must just come down to your personal preference, because like you, Laura, and Stuart as well, perhaps, I tended to find it exhilarating. I loved the way that it would suddenly divert from a major character like Amor, starting the novel opening with her and her perspective as she's taken out of school and she's taken to the house where she knows her mother has died, and the awful sadness of that. And then at the wake, suddenly it flits from these main characters to the side character of this minor priest who's there and this crisis of faith that he's having. And it rests on him for just a paragraph and then it jumps away again. But you've learned everything you need to know about that character in that brief little vignette. And I loved the way he did that. It felt interesting and exhilarating, and you didn't quite know where it was going to take you next.
I think you're right. You either love it or hate it, but it's funny that you should pick up on that moment, because that's the moment where I suddenly thought, this is really intriguing. It was jumping into that character's head that quickly became clear it was of no real significance in the overarching plot, but it just felt interesting. And at that point, I was like, yes, I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes.
They're not particularly likeable characters, and you get this very early on. Amor is the one that you feel the most sympathetic towards. She's sort of the one who grabs your heart at the beginning. You care about her and you see this family through her eyes. But of course, quickly you don't. You start to see through other people's eyes. And they are revealed very quickly to be grasping, petty, self-interested, self-loathing,
deeply
unhealthy.
Racist.
That's introduced very early on. So when Amor goes to the house, she comes to see Salome, who has brought her up alongside her mother. To everybody else, it's very clear very quickly that she's just invisible. It's like they don't really see her, or if they do, they order her around. Characters will literally say, don't worry about her, she doesn't have any feelings. And then this question of race and the white South Africans and the black South African within their midst, and the way that they feel about that, which, because you're seeing things through their perspective, you feel uncomfortably complicit in, continues throughout the book. And one of the other questions that came up for my book club felt a bit frustrating. It felt like we didn't really have time to debate it properly, and we didn't have the knowledge and understanding that maybe we needed to really understand what he was trying to achieve. But the criticism that some people leveled at it was that they felt like they were only hearing the white perspective of the story, and that they weren't hearing the black voices. The black characters weren't given a voice, and where they did appear, they tended to seem very stereotyped. They were youths who'd gone to jail or kind of ne'er-do-wells. To some people in my book club, I think that felt very reductive, and they were disappointed by that. I didn't feel like that when I read it. I felt that he was trying to do something more interesting with it, and it was quite subtle what he was trying to do. And on rereading it, it felt more clear to me that it's a very, very deliberate choice that he's made not to have those characters speaking, not to have them in a position of agency and control over their own stories.
I think it was really powerful, the fact that he was completely silent on that, and having, like I said, had a bit more time to investigate and research, it was clearly a decision he made intentionally. There's a really powerful bit which ties back to what we've already discussed around the changing perspective, but very near the end, he actually says to the reader, if Salome's home hasn't been mentioned before, it's because you have not asked, you didn't care to know. I remember that really hit home, that it had clearly been left out on purpose. It was interesting, drawing a little bit on my mother's experience. I was asking her about this after the criticism from the book club, and she was quite open. They had help when she was growing up, living with them, living in a room at the bottom of the garden kind of thing. And she said that nobody did pay any interest. No one asked about the life that these people were leading outside of what they saw. And unfortunately, it seems pretty representative of the white attitude towards those kind of helpers at the time.
And yet what I think he does that's so remarkable is that it's not even straightforwardly judgmental about these white South Africans that we're following throughout this novel. It felt like they themselves are shown to be victims of circumstance, especially as the children grow. This novel follows the passage of 4 decades. And so in that time, Amor grows from a young child to a 45-year-old woman when the story ends. And we see how the unequal society in which they live and were born into, it was not of their making. They inherited this situation and they grew up in this situation. And you see how the guilt of that knowledge of being effectively kind of usurpers in a country that you were born in, I felt was the thing that was sort of shown to be ultimately destroying them. Particularly the son, Anton. He's been conscripted into the army. So in that very fact about him is something telling. He didn't choose to go into the army to fight. He was conscripted. He was forced to go. And throughout this novel, characters are in positions where they're ending up doing things that they don't particularly want to do, but that's what's expected of them, or that's what they've come to expect of themselves. And so that dictates the way that they behave. And I just thought, well, you couldn't really be sympathetic towards them because they were just all awful. Even Amor, who is arguably the conscience of the novel, she is the good character in this novel, but even she, I think, is shown to be somehow flawed because she's still a part of this system and there is no solution to centuries of inequality.
Isn't that, on the flip side, though, what makes the novel so powerful and the characters so believable, the fact that they are complex? Because I actually felt a real sympathy for Anton. Like you said, he had no choice in being conscripted. He experienced a terrible event that almost set his life going down a completely different path. And you don't fully appreciate the impact that had on his life until his book is discovered late on. And you see that event, without wanting to give away any spoilers, has really had a massive impact and he's never really recovered from it. Suddenly you realise maybe why he acted in the way he did or why he was the way he was.
Yeah, I'm like you. I couldn't help but like Anton. I did rather like him. And there were moments where he showed flashes of kind of nobility of spirit, where you sort of wanted to say, yes, cheer him on, because he was the only one saying the thing that needed to be said. And yet ultimately, as with almost all the other characters in this book, I think this is why people find it depressing. No one really comes out of it well. And there is something a bit relentlessly downbeat about that. I did feel that the Amor character was a little bit of a cipher, is it? When a character exists for the purpose of moving the plot along. I would have loved it if she had had more depth. Her story had been more well-rounded. She sort of disappears. She holds herself at a distance because she has this principle at stake for her, which is if her family will not make good on the promise that she overheard her mother ask of her father and her father agree, if the family then won't make good on this promise, she then sort of withdraws and holds herself apart. And that's her way, the only way that she seems to be able to muster to put any kind of pressure on them or exert any influence of her own. But so as a result, she's quite absent for long stretches of the novel, and her absence is in itself almost like a kind of political act. For me, it left her feeling a bit one-dimensional in a way that I would have liked to have known more about her.
I think some of the book group did criticise that character for being a bit too saintly.
Yeah, I would level
and
that.
I think that's possibly fair. And I think we certainly feel that there's a good explanation for a lot of the choices that he made, but that one I do struggle with.
And then this wider political context and the idea that these people are all living in the aftermath of settler colonialism, which is brought to a head when finally we're going to find out if the promise is going to be fulfilled and if the land is going to be given to Salome. And the point is raised that the land was never theirs to give in the first place, that they themselves stole the land, going back to the original arguable theft of the land from the people that were living there in the first place, who were not consulted. What I thought was amazing about it is I don't know that much about South Africa. I've never been there. I felt like my knowledge was really sketchy. But nonetheless, I'm from England. We colonised the whole of the world. We went tromping around and took things that didn't belong to us and enriched ourselves in the process. America, an entire nation founded on people who went and took the land away from the Native Americans. Australia, same story. So it taps into, even now, if you really consider the privilege that we have and where it comes from, you can't feel very good about it. For me, of all the Booker Prize shortlist, it was the one that was grappling with the biggest ideas, the biggest scope of ideas, because it was not just a local story. It somehow managed to be something that I felt was global in the questions that it was raising and really thought-provoking in such a good way. You just feel challenged by it. Where do we read? It's a great story and you like the characters and it is incredibly, as you say, cinematic and you really feel like you're there and all the things that you want from a good novel, but it asks something of you as well and it causes you to question some things, which is what you want from art. And that's why I felt, for me, it was a very worthy winner.
I agree with your point that it makes you think about the global context, or maybe it connects with us in a different context. But I also wonder what we miss by not being in South Africa. Is Galgut writing for an international audience? I don't think he is. He is writing for South Africans. Stuart, do you have any thoughts on that?
I tend to agree with you, Laura. I certainly felt that it was writing more for a local audience. It felt like it had the conviction of an author who wasn't really trying to go for global stardom and wasn't trying to pander to an international audience, but was just telling some real truths that some of them do travel. Some of them, I think, we haven't really touched on some of the other themes of the book. Mortality and the passage of time and all of these elements, because I think, Kate, like you said, this book is so layered. There's so many different ideas in it.
Did you mention to me that your mother had read it?
Yeah, and she was firmly of the opinion that it was completely telling the truth. Like I mentioned, the story, you know, the attitude towards some of the black people through the 60s and 70s. My dad moved out to South Africa where he met my mum, and they bought a plot of land out in the middle of what was nowhere on the outskirts of Johannesburg at the time. And there was an old black couple living in like a tin shed on that piece of land that they'd bought. So on a very small scale, they've lived a similar kind of story to the one told in this book. And again, she said there was no talk of where they'd come from, and they felt that these people were encroaching on their land, and they had this feeling that this black couple thought this white couple were crazy, trying to build a house in the middle of nowhere with no running water and electricity. And then out of the blue one day, this couple disappeared and were never heard of again. I challenged my mum the same way you guys have alluded to and said, well, you know, whose land was it really? I mean, you bought that piece of land, but who did you buy it from and who did they get it from? I think those kind of experiences, there must be a lot of South Africans that had similar experiences through the time of the book.
It is a very dark novel, but at the same time, there are these flashes of dark humour that did liven it up for me and sometimes made me smile. There's this kind of wry, such a knowing quality to it that I appreciated.
I think sometimes it was just so outrageous that you couldn't help but laugh at some of the attitudes as well.
I mean, Anton, occasionally, he felt like the character with the most comic potential.
And the aunt as well, she was just so obnoxious at the start.
Tanny Marina.
Just
and Aki.
Exactly, just horrible people, but funny to kind of observe.
Well, it may have won the Booker Prize. I may think it was the most extraordinary piece of literature stroke art, but it did not go down well with book club, I think it's fair to say, who are open, curious, interested readers. And this book, to my surprise, really fell flat with them. I think the problem then when you come to read a Booker winner is that you have a certain set of expectations about what it is. And so then it's quite easy to be underwhelmed or disappointed. I also think it is a book that I feel like it asks something of you, it demands something of you as a reader, and it's not to say that my book club aren't equal to that kind of reading, because I know that they all are, they're all extraordinary readers. But they're also people who are quite busy, and I just had I could see them all, they're all sitting on their sofas listening to this, sitting up going, what's she going to say about us? I just felt they hadn't really had the time to reflect on it and to think about it. And maybe it wouldn't have changed anything if they had. I mean, you know, as ever, they gave interesting, thoughtful criticism and comments. Perhaps it's my own disappointment that I had wanted them to see more in this than they did. Maria gave it 2.5 out of 5.
That's crazy.
I thought that the way it was written was quite curious, the way he hovered in this way. This is the narrator. I did find it interesting to think about South Africa, all the little words that I was unfamiliar with. I found the family story interesting, but at the same time, I didn't like any of them. And it doesn't feel like a book that's going to stay with me at all. The formal brilliance seemed like smoke in your eyes when there's not that much substance underneath. Ooh. Meanwhile, Andy H. said it was an okay book, but for me, completely overrated. I liked the writing, found it easy to read, but I didn't care about any of the characters at all. It just didn't add anything to my experience of what I know about South Africa. I didn't feel I learned anything from it, and I didn't really enjoy reading it all that much. I didn't find the form particularly impressive either. Didn't feel anything, didn't think anything, laughed occasionally. That was about it.
I feel like that's the curse of the booker right there. I think that's Andy, a good friend of mine, being contrary. I feel like if he discovered it on his own, he would have been like, I found this amazing book.
Meanwhile, Amanda said she found it difficult because she loves South Africa. She has travelled there. She said the energy, the diversity, the youthfulness, the variety of it was like nowhere she'd ever been, and it had this incredibly powerful effect on her. And she found this novel such a different reflection of that. She wasn't seeing the South Africa that she knew and loved. She said there was a slight moment in the novel when the whole nation gets behind the rugby team that felt to her like something of the kind of joyful side, I suppose, of South Africa that she'd experienced. But for the rest, I think it was just very flat and downbeat. She said, I love the narrative voice hovering, and after our discussion, I'm becoming more aware of the layers of symbolism. Because I'd say the other thing is, I think in discussion, as we started to explore some of these topics, I think people were then reflecting on it slightly differently, which is interesting and goes to whether it would be a good book club book. But for me, Galgut didn't give me any insight into humanity that didn't feel hackneyed. His ideas about women, the way they felt about each other, felt tired. It felt prejudiced and limited, and I wanted more from it.
I agree with all of that, but I feel like it's a portrait of a prejudiced and limited culture, specific to one family, on the decline. That diverse, exciting South Africa that Amanda has interacted with is not the subject of this novel. It's about that old white culture founded on racism and inequality and its kind of disintegration.
And how Kate alluded to at the start, that there is an element of society, black and white, that do feel betrayed, that the promise in that wider context was never delivered, that everyone was building a new community together, and from their perspective it's never really happened.
Yeah. Looking online, you get good and bad. Jay Sweetman called it one of the books of the year, writing, "This is a stunning novel and a great read, unless perhaps you're a white South African who is disinclined to support majority rule and thinks your heritage has been stolen. It takes you into the heart of a country which is often held up as some shining example of democracy in action and reveals all the complexities which lie behind that easy story. It's about a promise and how a pledge can be half followed through, and that's a metaphor as well. It's also about how civil strife leaves terrible scars on a country and its culture. But in all of this, the book avoids sensationalism and mawkishness and has genuine characters who are multi-layered and interesting. It's one of the best books I've read this year and highly recommended." But not everyone agrees. Sirkan gave it 2 stars, writing, "It's not a terrible book, and certainly not the worst on the Booker long list, but I'm surprised it's been as well received as it has. It was a bit boring, with no tension to propel you forward. The plot was thin, the characters underdeveloped, and I'm not really sure it said anything fresh or interesting. The characters were like puppets. They participate in scenes, but they don't learn, change, or grow."
Like human beings?
Well, Penultimate gave it 2 stars, saying, "I was looking forward to reading this after the Booker Prize and all those great reviews, but I found implausible characterization, lack of coherence, artificial connections to political events, and irritating attempts at humour. One of the characters writes a novel which is described by another character as having a strong start that loses its way. I would describe The Promise as a novel that has a weak start that never finds its way."
Nah, that's just wrong. The structure of this novel is like rock solid.
Yeah.
I agree with you though, Kate. I think out of all of the book club, probably after yourself, I was probably most enthusiastic about this book, but probably not overly enthusiastic. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think I've really discovered so much more having had this opportunity to revisit it and really spend a bit more time understanding all the layers.
It goes to that thing, I think, you can have an experience reading this book on your own, and you can have quite a different experience if you read it and then discuss it. And to me, it definitely enhances and deepens the pleasure to be able to reflect on it and to be challenged and to hear those other perspectives, because when you do, that makes you sharpen your own viewpoints on it.
So a great book club book, perhaps, given that it was divisive. Lots of follow-on discussion. 3 enthusiasts here.
I was going to give the last word to Claire Massoud, the author, who says, "A surprising number of novelists are very good. Few are extraordinary. Like his compatriot J.M. Coetzee, the South African writer Damon Galgut is of this rare company. To praise the novel and its particulars, For its seriousness, for its balance of formal freedom and elegance, for its humour, its precision, its human truth, seems inadequate and partial. Simply, you must read it. Like other remarkable novels, it is uniquely itself and greater than the sum of its parts. The Promise evokes, when you reach the final page, a profound interior shift that is all but physical. This, as an experience of art, happens only rarely and is to be prized.
Uniquely itself, I think, is surprisingly the highest praise.
Inspired by The Promise, here are some more recommendations for your next book club read. Laura, what you got?
I am going to recommend Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. We talked about that on the podcast probably like 2 years ago. And the reason I can date it is because I listened to Trevor Noah read the audiobook in the early days of my daughter's life, and she's now 2. You know, I had audiobooks on while I was breastfeeding in the wee hours of the morning. And the first books I listened to couldn't grip me. I listened to Michelle Obama's memoir. It was a snooze fest. It did not grip me. Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. Holy smokes. There's a lot to distract you when you have a very small baby, but I loved this book and I was fully hooked. It is a memoir. Trevor Noah, if you don't know, listeners, I'm sure most of you do, is a very successful stand-up comedian and host of The Daily Show. He is South African. He grew up there before making the move to America in his early 20s to pursue his career. And the title Born a Crime reflects the fact that actually at the time he was born, in the last few years of apartheid, his existence was illegal because his father was white and his mother was black. And so when he would walk on the streets with his mother, she would force him to walk a few meters ahead of him and she would walk behind. So it wasn't immediately obvious that they were together. The authorities could not know that she was his mother, or there would have been consequences for both of them. It's also the story of South Africa during this period as Trevor Noah was growing up, and about the two communities he traverses but doesn't really fit into either, the white South African community and the black South African community. It's full of incredible anecdotes about life in South Africa at this time and the everyday perils that were a part of that existence, the endemic violence, the violence against women. His mother is shot, I should say, by a partner. She survives. At one point, they are basically being kidnapped by an unregulated taxi cab, and she throws herself and the 2 children out onto the street, like rolling down to get away. And as I say, I listened to the audiobook, and Trevor Noah is an incredible storyteller. It would be a really good book club book. I don't know how much you would have to debate, but you know what? Everyone would read it, and everyone would be very enthusiastic about the discussion.
For all I loved it, it's quite downbeat, The Promise, and this feels like it would be a nice antidote to that. You could read the two in partnership.
And interestingly, his story is incredible, but his childhood was also deeply troubling with, as I say, these violent instances. And it's testament to his mother and her character and her love for her children. And I think then her, Trevor Noah's, he's a special person, how he was able to rise up out of these circumstances. So yes, it's a definite crowd pleaser.
Sounds a bit like the Lem Sissay book, My Name is Why, where the thing that comes across that's so extraordinary about that book is this particular human being and his resilience and hope and optimism, but that he just happened to be that way, and it enabled him to transcend this incredibly difficult background where he was brought up in care homes and just really abandoned and not properly looked after by the state system in whose charge he was. You just feel so thrilled to have encountered such a special person at the end of it. I was going to recommend, I slightly on the back foot with this because it's perhaps testament to how singular I thought The Promise was, that I couldn't obviously think of any parallels, but I did, in researching it, come across various references to the work of Nadine Gordimer, who won the Nobel Prize and is an extremely famous and celebrated South African novelist. And then looking into her, I found her life fascinating. She was very brave. She was quite young. She was in her 20s when apartheid came into being, and she, much as the characters in The Promise, it was a situation that was not of her making, and she had to live with it, and she railed against it. And her first 2 books that she wrote were very much protest against, I think, this iniquitous system that she sort of saw happening all around her, and they were banned. They were banned by the government, but she continued to write, she continued to publish. Margaret Atwood wrote about her in The Guardian when she died. She died in 2014. She was an inspiration to all writers facing seemingly insurmountable odds within their own societies or facing a choice between risky truth-telling and personal comfort. It's difficult to imagine the history of the South African novel, indeed of the 20th century political novel, without her. But underneath all her work is the question posed in Ursula K. Le Guin's well-known story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. If you know that the beautiful manner of living you yourself enjoy is built on a foundation of misery, deliberately imposed on innocence, can you in conscience do nothing? Her own answer was always no. Have we talked about that Ursula Le Guin story?
Yes, we have.
We have. It's available online. It's absolutely extraordinary. It will take you 15 minutes, 20 minutes to read it, and it will stay with you for the rest of your life. It's such an extraordinary short story that actually, again, I see now, yes, it keys into many of the things that Galgut is raising with the promise and what we can live with, what we can look away from, and how we can rest easy with that, or can we? You know, perhaps we can't. There's another book I just read, very fresh in my mind actually, called Small Things Like These by an Irish author called Claire Keegan. And that's a 100-page novella, beautifully written, but in that quiet way that you're not even aware of it so much when you're reading it. The promise felt showy in a way that I found incredibly pleasing, but it was almost like he had made a conscious decision to draw attention to the writing in a way that this is very pared back, very reserved, and you follow this character of a coal merchant, Bill Furlong, who is responsible for providing fuel for this small town, 1980s town in Ireland. And he's delivering coal one day to a convent. And he encounters in the coal cellar on this freezing night, it's midwinter, a young girl or young woman who has been locked in this coal cellar and has been there possibly all night, possibly even for days, who is in this desperate state. And he takes her out and takes her round to the door, and he notices then that the doors are all sealed and that there's broken glass on the top of the walls, and that effectively the nuns are trying to keep something inside. And he returns her to the care of these nuns, and he's uneasy, and they sort of brush away his uneasiness. You know, they explain it away. Oh, they were playing hide and seek, and he learns that she had a baby. She tells him at one point, they took my baby away. Will you ask them about the baby? Ask them if they'll let me feed the baby. And at that moment, when she's been taken off by the nuns and he's with the Mother Superior, he doesn't feel able to ask about the baby. He feels he mustn't interfere. He feels that it's not his place. And his daughters, his own daughters, are at that convent school, which is the only good school in that town. So he's got something invested in the status quo himself. And gradually over the course of this short, beautiful novel, it's about a man's sort of internal struggle and his wrestling with his own conscience and his own understanding of what's right and what he can live with. And it builds to this conclusion which is moving and beautiful and hopeful. You know, these small things. You start to understand that the small acts of kindness and the small acts of integrity and honesty that can change society, or at least can bring some good to a world where often things are very wrong and are not the way that they should be.
I'm glad the word hopeful slipped in there because it was sounding pretty bleak.
Yeah, no, it's a profoundly hopeful and uplifting book. Yeah, no, I didn't mean it to sound bleak because it wasn't my experience of reading it, and I don't think she intended it that way. Although the subject she's exploring is bleak and true, I wasn't aware of it, but in fact, the government and the Catholic Church were united in this system of these laundries that unmarried women who had had children were sent to, and their children were taken away, and they were forced to work and exploited and abused. And it was only really not so very long ago that there was finally some acknowledgement of all the harm that had been done and the huge human cost. But yeah, so I really recommend that. But that was just going to recommend a book I haven't read. But which I would be really interested to read, which is The Conservationist. It also won the Booker Prize. Claire Armistead reviewed it in The Guardian. Gordimer was joint winner of the Booker Prize for this novel, which exposes the delusions of apartheid through the character of Mehring, a rich white businessman turned dilettante farmer, who is confronted with an unidentified corpse on his land. Mehring's certainty that he always does the right thing is undermined by a narrative that constantly undercuts his smug conservatism. Considering the novel as a contender for the best of Booker Prize, Sam Jorgensen wrote, "The intensity of this writing requires serious concentration, especially when coupled with an impressionistic narrative that skips backwards and forwards over time and situates us right inside Mary's head, an increasingly unpleasant place to be. It's hard work, but is correspondingly effective." And I just thought, that sounds like it would be a really interesting counterpart to The Promise and full of fuel for book club discussion.
That's all for this episode.
Our book recommendations were Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, My Name is Why by Lem Sissay, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, and The Conservationist by Nadine Gordimer. Check out the episode page on our website for more detailed listings and follow-on links. The audiobook is published by Penguin Audio, narrated by Peter Noble, and available for download now. This episode of the Book Club Review Pod was produced and edited by me, Kate Slotover.
On our next show, we're considering things to look forward to in 2022. From the publishing big hitters to the little-known names to watch, we're getting the inside scoop from Bookbar's Chrissy Ryan and Elizabeth Morris of Crib Notes. Two women with their fingers firmly on the pulse of the book world. So grab a pen and paper and get ready to plan your 2022 TBR.
If you enjoyed this show, check out our website, where you can find our archive of over 100 shows to browse through. You can also sign up to our bi-weekly-ish newsletter for reviews and recommendations between shows.
Do keep in touch by following us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or you can always email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts?
If you want to support us, please do take a moment to rate and review the show. It really helps, as does sharing the details on social media. We love finding new listeners and treasure every single one. Share with your parents, share with your aunts and uncles, share with all the people who are never going to find out about us any other way.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.